Chapter 4. I didn't tell May. She was already frightened, and now I suspected she had reason to be. There was no point in alarming her further. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more it seemed that the real importance of what had happened concerned me, not her. Up to this point, I'd been a rather reluctant Good Samaritan, and of course, that still might be my position. Brightman, after all, was a rich man. He lived in a rich neighborhood, and perhaps I'd only interrupted a burglar. On the other hand, it was this other hand that now gave me a twinge of guilt. If Brightman's disappearance was more than inconsiderate, if it had a darker side, then conceivably his concern about May's adoption might be linked to it. I still didn't see how, but the next morning, really for the first time, I began taking the whole business seriously. I worked fast. Once upon a time, I'd been a fair reporter, and information had been my bread and butter. When you are just starting out, you obtain it by the exercise of certain skills. Later on, you simply use contacts. That's what I needed now, and I began searching for them at the main branch of the Toronto Public Library. First, with the New York Times Index, then in a microfilm reader. There I learned that adoption, if not exactly front-page news, had become something of a social issue in the late 70s. Procedures were being questioned, adopted children were demanding the right to know their birth parents. Various organizations were agitating. I read through a dozen stories, mainly concerned with the United States, but one compared American practices with those in other countries, including Canada. I'd never heard of the writer, but of course I know a dozen people in the Times. Phoning from May's place, I quickly discovered that my man was now staffing at CBS and tracked him down there. As expected, he was happy to help. Now I was one of his contacts. To get his paragraph on Canada, he told me he'd spoken with a woman at the Toronto Globe and Mail named Eileen Rogers. I called the Globe, and it was my lucky day. Miss Rogers knew my name, or pretended to. She'd done a 3-part feature on adoption in Canada, and she didn't have a date for lunch. We went to a restaurant in a small hotel off Bloor Street, not far from where May and I had been walking the previous night. It was quiet, pleasant, elegant. A courtyard had been glassed in, and ad men and TV types padded their paunches and expense accounts as the pale October sun filtered down through the roof. Eileen Rogers fitted the place well enough. She was a real type, the young, tough, ambitious lady reporter who'd worked her way up from the woman's page to the political columns and was now scanning the wider horizon beyond. That horizon, I expected, extended south of the border, for she was curious about all those Canadians who've made it big in the American media. Peter Jennings, Morley Safer, Robin McNeil, a dozen others. I gave her some hints and names, but mostly, of course, she was earning the right to drop my name, which was fine because, in return, she gave me a top-class briefing on Canadian adoption law and procedures. In Canada, she said, adoption was under provincial jurisdiction, just as, in the United States, the field belonged to the individual states. Most of the provinces, again, like most of the states, had established official or semi-official bodies to handle the whole business. They were usually styled children's aid societies here, but differed little from the adoption agencies in the United States. She didn't think much of them on either side of the border. It's disgusting, really. They have a sort of monopoly on infant misery, and all they care about is maintaining their power. They've built up huge empires, bureaucracies, programs, funding from here, funding from there. Doing that series, I learned to loathe social workers. I sipped white wine, forked salad. How does all this affect me, if I'm trying to track down someone's parents? Oh, you run right up against the basis of the whole system, which is secrecy. Absolute, sacrosanct, legalized secrecy. Once a mother signs over her baby, she loses all rights to it, and the kid loses all rights as well. Neither of them can ever find out about the other. That's the basis of the society's power. They get complete control. It's all rationalized. Adoptive parents mustn't be haunted by the specter of the birth mother returning. But it's all bull. They threw it out the window in the UK with no ill effects, and in some countries it's never been true. Finland, for instance. According to her, if May had been adopted through a children's aid society, in her case it would be the society in the province of Nova Scotia. There was only one way to find out who the birth mother was, an inside contact. She hinted that under the right circumstances, she might be forthcoming, but I held off on that. Just possibly there was another way. Most adoptions were handled by the Children's Aid Societies, but private adoptions, arranged through lawyers and doctors, still existed. The agencies hate them, of course, but lawyers make money from them. Also sacrosanct, and in some cases they're just more convenient all around. It makes it easier for the rich to hide their kids' indiscretions, and then there's the sort of case where the parents are wiped out in a car crash and a relative picks up the children. So the lawyer would be the key then. Yeah, if you could get him to talk. He was around 3 by the time I got back to May's house and told her the gist of what I'd found out. So it's going to be very hard, she said, if I was adopted through one of these societies? Yes, but I think this girl knows some people inside the system, at least in Ontario. That would be a big help. You won't get in trouble? Don't worry. It would be easier, though, if we knew whether or not you were adopted privately. All I know is what I told you. I was adopted in 1940 in Halifax. But your father must have a lawyer? Of course. His name is Stuart Cadogan. I don't much like him. Do they go back that far, to 1940? Probably. He's old enough. He'd probably know anyway. Phone him and find out. If he says you were adopted privately, make it an appointment, and we'll go see him. We were in the kitchen again, drinking coffee. Now May glanced quickly down at the table. If you don't mind, if you need to see him, I'd rather you went by yourself. As I say, I don't like him. We never get along. Her fear, I felt it flicker again. May, you're sure that's everything you know? You realize there's no point holding anything back. She reached up with both hands, combing her fingers back through her hair. Then she smiled, and her voice was calm. You have to understand. I don't care if you know. If there's something to know, if he has something to tell you, I don't mind your finding out. But I don't want to. Not unless I absolutely have to. All right, but you may have to, whether you like it or not. You realize that. I know, but I've lived my life with one story, and I prefer not to change it, even if my adoption is connected to Harry's going away. I'd rather you take that connection to the police and let them find him, if it's possible, if you could do it like that. I nodded, though I wasn't exactly happy about it. I'll try, but, this lawyer may not be prepared to see me alone. Your adoption is confidential, privileged. Don't worry, I'll fix that. I waited in the kitchen while May used the phone in the hall. In 10 minutes she was back. Good news, my adoption was private. But he won't talk about it? Well, he didn't want to, but I persuaded him. My goodness, he's officious. I have to write a letter giving him formal instructions. Stuart Cadogan, QC. I was looking forward to meeting him. He'd agreed to see me that day, but not till 6:30, and so I set off at dusk in May's Volkswagen, braving the city's traffic for the first time. It wasn't difficult. Toronto is a commercial town. At that hour, no one was making money in the great skyscrapers, but the crowds hadn't begun to spend it yet in the restaurants and bars, so the streets were gray, empty, forlorn. Cadogan's offices were on Victoria Street, just beyond Yonge. I parked, then walked a block to an old red brick house with stone steps, a columned porch, and a heavy oak door festooned with the appropriate plaque. Inside was a dim foyer and a desk for a porter. This gentleman, black-suited and very ancient, led me upstairs. Old, rich law firms can be very impressive, and Cadogan's fell into that category. Paddling along in the porter's dignified wake, I could almost hear the money rustling in their escrow accounts. I passed through a door into an outer office. A secretary, kept late for my benefit, and a trifle peevish, took me over. "You're Mr. Thorne?" "That's right." I would have put her age at 60. She wore a navy suit with a white blouse, and the eyeglasses dangling around her neck bobbed with her goiter. She pressed in intercom. "Mr. Thorne to see you, sir." The indefinite article somehow made me feel less than reputable, but at least they hadn't kept me waiting, and as the secretary held the door, I stepped straight through into Cadogan's sanctum. It was large and gloomy. The rugs on the floor were probably Cashin's, though a trifle threadbare, and the fire in the marble fireplace was blue, flickering coal. The overall effect was one of but wealth that was practical, parsimonious Scotch. Greeting me, Cadogan lifted himself out of a chair behind an old wood desk. He was very tall, somewhat stooped, with a large bald head. His hands were also large, the knuckles bumpy and twisted. He could have been a school principal, a retired person, or indeed just what he was. Accepting May's letter, he indicated a leather club chair by the corner of his desk. I sat and watched him fish spectacles from the pocket of his suit coat. Fitting those to his nose, He began to read, frowning and suspicious. When he was finished, he laid the sheet of paper on his desk and pressed it flat with one of his huge bony hands. Then he glanced up at me. "You'll not take this personally, Mr. Thorne, but you'll understand that I was reluctant to see you?" "I gathered that, yes." "You'll even admit, perhaps, that your situation is somewhat equivocal?" "Yes, I suppose I would." A smile flickered. "Then you'll be aware that mine must be too." I said nothing. After a moment he grunted, which I took as a sign that he'd come to some provisionally favourable conclusion about me. He got to his feet. "It's after 6. You'll take something to drink, Mr. Thorne?" "Thank you, sir. That would be very pleasant." He stepped around his desk to a lacquered cabinet near the fireplace. His suit was brown, for him, no doubt, an example of sartorial daring. It was several years out of date, and, as with many old men, seemed to hang a little loosely on his large frame. He took bottles and glasses out of the cabinet. "You're a young man, and will prefer whiskey. I am old, and must make do with sherry." This was a joke, so I smiled, but in fact he didn't look around to see what effect his remark might have had. I watched him pour. Naturally, there was no offer of water or ice. He brought me my glass, and I noticed that his hand, extending it, trembled slightly. I sipped. To my surprise, it was Canadian whiskey. I would have guessed Scotch. This must have shown on my face, for Cardigan smiled. "In this country, Mr. Thorne, we call it rye." "It's very good, wherever you're from." Perhaps he thought me incapable of normal civility, for he nodded a little, as if surprised. Then he settled himself beside his desk, his glass of sherry lost inside his vast hand. "As I understand it," he said, "you're trying to find Miss Brightman's father." "Not quite that. May thinks her adoption might have some connection to her father's disappearance, and has asked me to look into it." His eyes didn't leave mine, but his hand edged over his desk to a file that was lying there. "Adoption, a very private concern." "Yes." "Intimate business. Family business." "I understand. You realize, I suppose, that I offered to tell Miss Brightman everything I know about the matter, but she asked me to tell only you?" "Yes." "She must trust you?" "Yes, I think she does." "Without wishing to give offense, Mr. Thorne, may I ask if you're absolutely certain that you understand what trust means in a matter like this?" He had mildly given offense, and I didn't mind showing it. "I don't think you have to worry about that, Mr. Cadogan." "Good. I shall cease doing so, but you also understand that I am under no obligation to tell you anything at all. May Brightman is my client as well as her father, and she has an obvious interest in this, but these papers come from Harry Brightman's file, not hers. Only he, strictly speaking, can give you permission to read them." "I'm sure that's true, strictly speaking." He shot me a glance. "As a lawyer, Mr. Thorne, I find nothing wrong with strict speaking." I hesitated. I didn't want to argue with him. Besides, I knew that eventually he'd do as May's letter had instructed. I said, "Can I ask if you think there's some connection, that is, between Brightman's disappearance and his daughter's adoption?" He frowned, irritated at this change of direction, but then he grunted again. "I don't say yes, Mr. Thorne, but I don't say no either. In any case, I'd let you see these because I know that Harry Brightman would wish me to do as his daughter has asked, and because, as you will see, they contained very few secrets." Abruptly, before I could question this, he shoved the file across his desk. "You will know nothing about adoption law, but that is hardly necessary. May Brightman wasn't adopted under any statute that is in force today. Indeed, in 1940, the relevant law dated back to the 20s. It is a quirk that in law which gives her case a peculiar interest. You'll understand as you read." Without saying anything, I opened the file. The first item was a carbon on flimsy paper of an old memo from T. Tugwell to G.C. It summarized the Nova Scotia Adoption Act, Chapter 139 of the Revised Statutes, 1923, and concentrated especially on the consents that had to be obtained before an adoption decree would be granted. Theoretically, these might include the consent of everyone, from the child itself, if it was over 14, to the husband if the person being adopted was a married woman. But they could also be waived under a variety of circumstances. If the person whose consent would normally be required was insane, was in a penitentiary, had neglected the child, or allowed to be charitably supported. Furthermore, the memo went on, if a person whose consent was normally required couldn't be found, the court could advertise for that person and then declare, if he or she still hadn't come forward, that consent was taken as given. Finally, the memo concluded, no, the child's physical presence would not normally be required in court, and yes, our client would have to be married. This is not stated as an explicit provision of the law, but in practice is almost always required. Thanking God that I'd never been tempted by a legal career, I looked up at Cadogan. I assume this was drafted after a request by Brightman? Yes, it's not in the file. Probably he came into the office and spoke with my father personally. I looked back to the top of the page. G.C. is your father? Yes. I turned back to the file. The next items were letters to Brightman, at a hotel in Halifax, more or less restating the memo, and a letter to a law firm in Halifax saying that he would approach. Brightman had acknowledged this with a note, so for the first time I saw his signature, broad, open, easy, in keeping with the face in the photograph. Cadogan said, You'll have noted that the important point is the requirement to advertise. Section 4, Chapter 139. The paper used for such notices is normally the provincial government's journal of record, the Royal Gazette, and the next items in that file are tear sheets from it. They were old and yellowed. As I took them up, the brittle paper flaked under my fingers. On this page were estate notices, appointments of crown attorneys, regulations concerning the blackout, for this was 1940, and the Second World War was underway. In the middle of all, this was the heading, Adoption Act re Florence Esther Raines. Beneath it was printed, to Florence Esther Raines, whose present address is unknown, and who is the mother of Elizabeth Ann Raines. Take notice that pursuant to the provisions of the order, a copy of which is given hereunder, you are advised that a petition has been presented for the adoption of the child Elizabeth Ann Raines, a copy of which petition is hereunder given, and that said petition will be heard and considered at County Court Chambers at the Law Courts, Spring Garden Road, Halifax, N.S., on Friday, the 28th day of June, A.D. 1940, at the hour of 10 o'clock in the afternoon. R.A. Powell, Duke Street, Halifax, N.S., Solicitor for Petitioners. Skipping down the page, I came to the petition itself, the complete, comprehensive, and legally certified story of May Brightman's adoption, 1940 CC number 1289, in the County Court for District number 1 in the matter of Chapter 139 RSNS 1923 of the adoption of children, and in the matter of Elizabeth Ann Raines' petition. To His Honor A.F. Best Judge of the County Court for District number 1. The petition of Harold Charles Brightman of the City of Toronto, in the County of York, in the Province of Ontario, merchant, and Ellen Sarah Brightman, his wife, humbly she with 1. Your petitioner, Harold Charles Brightman, has resided at Toronto in the County of York for some years, and is a merchant dealing in furs. Your petitioner, Ellen Sarah Brightman, is the wife of the said Harold Charles Brightman. 2. Your petitioners are desirous of adopting a female child, Elizabeth Ann Raines, who is the illegitimate child of Florence Esther Raines of Halifax, in the County of Halifax. 3. Said child is of the age of 10 months, having been born on the 12th day of June, A.D. 1939. Said child was abandoned in the care of Charles Granger, M.D., within a few weeks of her birth, and has been charitably maintained by him since that. 4. Your petitioners believe that the mother of the said child was of the Protestant faith. Your petitioners are members of the Church of England and would give the said child instructions in the doctrines of that church. 5. Your petitioners are both over the age of 21 years and are of sufficient means and ability to bring up the said child and are able to furnish, nurture, and education. 6. Your petitioners request that the name of the said child Elizabeth Ann Raines be changed to Sarah May Brightman. 7. Your petitioners therefore pray that an order be made by this honorable court pursuant to the provisions of Chapter 139 RSNS 1923, whereby the said child may be adopted as their child by your petitioners. And your petitioners will ever pray, etc. Harold Charles Brightman, Ellen Sarah Brightman. I turned the page over. The last item in the file was the adoption order itself. I wasn't stunned by all this, but I was more than a little surprised, especially in the light of what I'd been told about secrecy by my lady reporter that morning. I looked up at Cadogan. So this means that May Brightman's adoption has always been public knowledge? It was an exceptional case, of course, but the various suggestions she made on the phone, blackmail and so forth, are out of the question. There have never been any secrets about her adoption, and as you see, it was all entirely legal. But no, I thought out loud, entirely regular. How is that, Mr. Thorne? I'm thinking of Brightman's marriage. I flipped back through the file. In this first memo, there's the clear implication that he wasn't married when the proceedings began. Your clerk stressed that he'd have to be, so it must have been a marriage of convenience, especially remembering that he divorced so soon afterwards. Cadogan gave me a frosty smile. Surely, Mr. Thorne, all marriages should be convenient. There's nothing illegal or even irregular about that. But I wasn't going to be put off. Still, it must normally work the other way around. This is, the desire to adopt a baby arises out of the marriage rather than preceding it. Perhaps that's so, he concluded. But I suspect that Harry Brightman wasn't the first man to desire a child without having to put up with a wife. He was a wealthy man. Even then, like many wealthy men, he simply arranged matters to suit him. Somehow this rang a bell, and I had it, but not quite. Brightman, a wealthy man, wants a child, but not any child, this child. Instead of adopting in his own town, he travels all the way to Nova Scotia because— But then the thought slipped away, and I tried a different tact altogether. I gather that you weren't a member of the firm when all this was happening. Technically speaking, I was, but I had been seconded, if you like, to the Royal Canadian Air Force. This was 1940, remember. There was a war on. You people weren't in it, but we were. There was a slight hint of disapproval in this, and I wondered what he would have said if he'd known that my father, at precisely that point, had been carrying on business as usual with the Germans in Paris. I said, "So your personal knowledge of the matter is limited. It's all second-hand?" "If you like, if that's material. I was just wondering if you ever talked to Brightman about it." "Very little, and only much later. I handled the divorce. He had to tell me a little about it then." "And when was that?" "I think 1951 or 52. By that time he had been living apart from his wife for many years." "Could his wife have had anything to do with this?" "No. But you don't entirely rule out a connection between Brightman's disappearance and the adoption." Now, for the first time, Cadogan seemed uneasy. His eyes dropped. Then, with a fussy movement, he removed his spectacles and slipped them into his pocket. He said, "Mr. Thorne, when men say they wish to speak frankly, they usually intend to tell you a lie. But in fact, I want you to know what's in my mind. That is difficult, however. I have been Harry Brightman's lawyer for a very long time. He has less legal business today than formerly, but what there is I handle myself. And when he sold his business, a complex matter, I handled that. Even going back further, he frequently called on my services. He manufactured and sold furs, but he also imported and exported them. Ocelots came from Argentina, jaguars from Brazil. There are problems selling mink in America. He was always having difficulties with permits and regulations of one sort or another. You understand." "Go on." "All right. On the last occasion I saw him, our regular lunch, I sensed that something was different. I had the feeling that something was troubling him, something that lay beyond the normal bounds of our relationship. He mentioned a woman. It was clear that he meant a liaison, an infatuation in his past, but it was all very fleeting. It wasn't the sort of thing he'd normally have spoken about, and you realize that it's not the sort of thing I'd normally speak of to you." I nodded. Indeed, the difficulty he'd had in speaking at all made me sense that his feeling for Brightman was more personal than he'd let on. "I understand, sir. Did he mention a name?" "Anna," he said. "When I look back, Anna is my deepest regret." We'd been talking about the past, the war. He'd had something to drink, perhaps more than he'd usually take. He spoke as if I knew what he was talking about. "But you didn't?" "No." "And you didn't ask who this woman was?" "It would have embarrassed us both." "I see. But there are no Annas involved in any of this. The baby was called Elizabeth Ann." He lifted his hand from his desk in a dismissive gesture. "Does that make any difference? A nickname? A pet name?" And now at last I had it. I could hear May's voice in my ear. He said he wanted to tell me who my real father was, but surely the usual focus of interest was the mother's identity. All of which must have shown on my face, for now Cadogan said, "I take it you've drawn the obvious conclusion, Mr. Thorne." "Yes, sir." I had. May Brightman was Harry Brightman's natural child. In adopting her, he'd merely been adopting his own illegitimate daughter. I said, "Did you just reach this conclusion then, during that conversation?" "No, it was a suspicion I'd held for a good many years." "Had you ever tried to confirm it?" "No, it was none of my business. Conceivably, I realized it might have had some effect on his will, but I drafted it to take that into account." He hesitated a moment. "In that conversation, you see, I thought he was depressed. Not quite himself, but there was nothing dramatic about it. I have no reason to suppose that it had anything to do with his going away. If he hadn't, I doubt that it would have stuck in my mind. I nodded. The old man leaned back in his chair. Then, rather deliberately, he looked at his watch. If you don't mind, I think I've told you all that I know. Yes, sir, and I thank you for doing so. I rose. Cadogan didn't hold out his hand. I considered, then decided not to offer him mine. But as I turned to leave, he stopped me. Mr. Thorne, earlier I asked if you knew the meaning of trust. I hope you now understand why. Would I tell her? That's what he was thinking. But right then I couldn't have answered, so I merely nodded, turned, and went out the door. Outside, the porter was waiting, and I followed him down the stairs and through the big oak doors to the street. The sidewalk was dark and deserted. A drizzle was falling. Standing there, I let it prickle, cold and sharp, on my face. I took a deep breath. Would I tell her? I really had no idea what to do, and all at once it must have been the rain. I was back in that graveyard where my father was buried, and an uncanny sensation passed through me, an obscure, distressing feeling that I was not here by accident, that somehow Brightman's fate was intimately connected to my own. In a strange way, the story of May's origins was becoming my secret, and so, by a natural progression, was becoming allied to that other secret I held, the truth about my father's suicide. No wonder I found it disturbing, but there was an assumption in this, that I'd definitely kept back what I'd discovered. Should I? May's instructions had been clear enough. She didn't want to know unless it became absolutely necessary. Perhaps given that, I had no right to tell her, for there was still no certainty that the adoption and Brightman's disappearance were connected. Why, given the facts, should he have fled? No doubt they would have upset May to some extent, but hardly as much as his abrupt departure had done. In the end, after all, the truth could have only served to draw them closer together. What should I do? As I walked along, a soft voice began whispering the answer. Let it alone, let it alone. But I suppose, even then, I knew that I wouldn't. Whether I liked it or not, this was my secret. Now, I'd found out something that no one had ever been intended to know, and there had to be more. What was it? As I reached the car, I remembered what the King of Hearts had told Alice. Begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end. Then stop. For May Brightman, and perhaps for her father, the beginning lay in Halifax, Nova Scotia, during the Blitzkrieg spring of 1940.